Hi folks. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the day gently fades, we invite you to step back into the 18th century, to the beginning of a remarkable life. Her name was Catherine. But before she ruled an empire, before her name echoed through palaces and history books, she was simply Sophie, a young girl in a cold corner of Europe, quietly watching, listening, and learning. Born far from power, she survived not by force, but with patience, grace, and a mind as sharp as winter's wind. This isn't a story of loud triumphs. It's a story of silent strength, of slow ambition, and of a woman who changed the world, one quiet moment at a time. So, settle in. Let your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and allow the story to carry you gently towards sleep. And if this journey brings you peace, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more calm tales from the past. Imagine a quiet winter's night in 1729. In a modest town called Stettin along the Oder River, a baby girl is born, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. The world she enters is far from royal grandeur, a stark contrast to the magnificent Russian Empire she will one day command. Her early life is humble, surrounded by simple comforts and a quiet family life. But from the very beginning, Sophie is destined for something far greater than her provincial surroundings. The tiny town of Stettin was peaceful, but life in the Russian court, that was about to change everything for young Sophie. At this point, she had no idea that her destiny would soon take her across Europe to a land of imperial intrigue and grand expectations. She didn't know that her name would one day echo through history, but somewhere deep within her, something stirred. It was a quiet ambition, one that would slowly build, like the quiet, steady hum of an approaching storm. Now as you sit back and relax, picture yourself near a crackling fire. You're reflecting, just like Sophie might have done in those early years. You can almost feel the cold of Stettin in your bones, and yet there's a warmth in your chest, a quiet curiosity, just like hers. You're about to join her on a journey that will change everything. From the modest beginnings in Germany to the imperial palaces of Russia, Sophie will soon become Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. But we're not there yet. The path is just beginning. This is where we begin our journey together, dear listener, at the very start with Sophie, whose early life was far from the power and intrigue that would one day define her. In fact, at this point, Sophie had no idea of the great power that lay ahead. She was a princess, yes, but in a world of small kingdoms and quiet courtly life. Little did she know, Russia was calling. By the time Sophie was 14, her life took an unexpected turn. A mysterious invitation arrived from the Russian court. It wasn't just any invitation. It was a summons for her to marry the future emperor, Peter III of Russia. And so, Sophie found herself leaving behind the cozy town of Stettin and boarding a ship to a land she could scarcely imagine. The cold, vast Russia that would soon become her empire. No longer the quiet life of a German princess, but a complicated world of courtly schemes and political power. When she arrived in Russia, Sophie, now renamed Catherine, found herself in an empire far grander than anything she had known. But grandeur, of course, had its costs. The Russian court was a labyrinth of politics, where every step had consequences, and every gesture was measured. The palace was magnificent, but it was cold, not just in its architecture, but in its isolation. Sophie had entered a world where survival required more than beauty and grace. It required strategy, and endurance. Her marriage to Peter III was not the love story one would expect from a princess turned empress. In fact, Peter was as eccentric and distant as Catherine was ambitious. Their marriage was more a political alliance than a romantic union, and it became clear that the path to power would not be through love. But for Catherine, this was merely the beginning of something much bigger. She knew she needed to play her cards carefully. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a high-stakes political game. But Catherine wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. It wasn't long before Catherine realized that her marriage wasn't going to be the key to her power. Peter was more interested in toys and trivial pursuits than in ruling an empire. And Catherine? She had bigger plans, but she didn't show it at first. No, instead she watched, she listened, and she waited for the right moment to strike. Her life at court, with its endless formalities and public performances, was not the life she had dreamed of. Catherine was no fool. She knew that to gain power in Russia, she needed more than beauty or a title. She needed influence, and to get that, she had to play the game, and play it well. She learned to survive in the shadows, to observe the key players around her, and to slowly weave her way into the very heart of the Russian Empire. It's almost as if fate had prepared her for this very moment. A young girl, far from her family, married to a man who hardly seemed capable of ruling. Catherine had no choice but to adapt. It wasn't the royal life she had expected, but it was a life full of opportunities, hidden beneath layers of political intrigue. The question, of course, was, would she seize them? If I were to guess, Catherine must have had a quiet chuckle at some of the absurdities of her life at that time. Picture it. A teenage girl, newly arrived in Russia, expected to navigate the labyrinth of the Russian court, all while married to a man who seemed completely uninterested in ruling. If there was ever a moment for Catherine to wonder, what have I gotten myself into? I'd imagine it was then. The awkwardness of her situation must have been almost comical. It wasn't all elegance and dancing at the royal ball. No, instead, it was endless hours spent navigating the politics of the court, learning to bow correctly, and making the best of a marriage that seemed more like a political convenience than a personal union. But Catherine wasn't one to back down from such absurdity. If anything, she learned to laugh at it and use it to her advantage. So, here we are, Catherine, now Empress of Russia, standing on the precipice of a new life. Her early years, though filled with confusion and struggle, were the foundation of something much larger. The future Empress had already begun to carve her path, quietly and with purpose, even if the world around her didn't see it yet. Imagine, if you will, the quiet strength growing within her. Catherine knew what she wanted, and now it was just a matter of making it happen. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were many trials to face, many political battles to fight. But Catherine's heart, like Russia's, was about to undergo a transformation. From humble beginnings to the heights of imperial power, she would become a woman of legend. But that legend had to be earned, one silent step at a time. Now we prepare for the next chapter of her journey, the moment when Catherine's quiet rebellion turns into action. But for now, take a deep breath, relax, and reflect on what we've learned. That even the greatest empresses start as quiet, humble girls, wondering where the journey will take them. Catherine's arrival in Russia was less princess living the dream and more foreign guest trying to survive a very cold reception. She was married to Peter III, a young man whose grasp on governance was as tenuous as his grasp on a military uniform. But Catherine, being no fool, had no intention of letting this royal marriage become a footnote in history. It wasn't the fairy tale she dreamed of, but it might just become the empire she ruled. Her marriage to Peter was less a union and more of a political handshake, one that had all the warmth of a block of ice. Peter, who was more interested in toy soldiers than actual governance, made no effort to hide his indifference toward Catherine. If there was any love to be found in this relationship, it was buried beneath layers of neglect and frustration. Still, Catherine was resourceful. Her dreams of being a queen might have been dashed, but her ambitions had merely begun to bubble beneath the surface. Peter's obsession with his toys and military drills left Catherine in an isolated court, where she was a foreigner in more ways than one. She wasn't Russian, and the nobility made it clear that she wasn't one of them. But Catherine, ever the strategist, knew that survival in the Russian court wasn't about gaining affection. It was about gaining influence. If she wanted power, she would have to build it herself. The palace was a chessboard, and Catherine had already learned how to play her pieces. While Peter played with his soldiers, Catherine quietly observed. She watched the whispers that flowed through the palace halls, the glances exchanged behind closed doors. She began to understand that power wasn't just held by the loudest voice. It was held by the one who listened the most. Catherine, with her cool exterior and sharp mind, was learning how to make alliances, build support, and wait for her moment. Her days were spent in the shadow of a man who had no understanding of the weight his crown carried. Peter's reign was a delicate thing, held together by incompetence and a lack of foresight, and Catherine could see the cracks forming. Peter's rule was weak, and soon the cracks would give way. It wasn't just inevitable, it was opportunity. But Catherine wasn't rushing. She knew that timing was everything. The Russian court, with all its grandeur and power, was as cold and unpredictable as the Russian winter. Catherine's early years were spent in the trenches, so to speak, observing, listening, and waiting. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. And while Peter busied himself with trivialities, Catherine began to see the political landscape more clearly. She wasn't just a wife standing by her husband. She was a participant, a student of power. Catherine's patience wasn't just about waiting for Peter to fail. It was about preparing for when he inevitably did. The palace wasn't a playground for idle royalty. It was a battleground, and Catherine knew that if she wanted to emerge as more than just a forgotten figure in a dusty royal ledger, she'd have to act. But not just yet. Not until everything was in place. Peter, blissfully unaware, was losing favour with the nobility and the military, and the whispers of discontent were growing louder. Catherine was taking note, quietly building a network of support. She wasn't going to be the passive wife who watched it all crumble around her. No, she was going to be the one who changed the course of history. But she would do it in her own time, in her own way, with grace, precision, and a lot of dry humour along the way. Catherine, ever the observer, had learned that survival in the Russian court wasn't about being loud. It was about being quiet, strategic, and letting everyone else believe they were in control. Her marriage to Peter was, at best, a polite arrangement. Peter, obsessed with toy soldiers and grand military fantasies, seemed to care more about battle tactics than governing. Meanwhile, Catherine was quietly absorbing everything around her, watching the cracks form in Peter's reign. She didn't need to be a part of Peter's inner circle to see that the tides were shifting. His reign, full of impulsive decisions and neglect, was increasingly seen as weak. The nobles, once charmed by his eccentricities, began to see his failings. The military, ever watchful, was also growing disillusioned. Peter, with his erratic behaviour, was no longer a man they could trust to lead Russia. And Catherine, she wasn't waiting for his downfall. She was preparing for it. Catherine's patience was her weapon. While Peter floundered, Catherine played the long game. She didn't need to rush. The court was filled with whispers and dissatisfaction, and all she needed to do was listen, support the right people, and remain in the background. In the grand cold halls of the Winter Palace, she began building quiet alliances, choosing her words carefully with anyone who mattered. Her great skill, however, was listening. While the nobles argued and the military grumbled, Catherine watched. She knew how to make others feel heard without revealing her true thoughts. It wasn't about promising grand changes. It was about planting the seeds of trust and letting them grow without anyone noticing. Catherine's strategy was simple yet effective. She approached the military officers, those whose loyalty was not yet tied to Peter, and listened. She didn't promise them power or riches. She simply acknowledged their concerns and made them feel as if their opinions mattered. In a court that was filled with those eager for attention, Catherine understood that silence could be more powerful than 1,000 words. She never interrupted. She just let them talk, and in doing so she subtly gained their confidence. The nobles, of course, were a different challenge. They weren't so easily swayed. But Catherine had learned the importance of subtlety. She didn't try to outshine the empress or play to the nobility's need for spectacle. No, she moved through the court with grace, keeping her words light and her presence almost invisible. The nobles didn't need another flashy royal. They needed someone who could be trusted to rule wisely. And Catherine, with her quiet charm and dry humour, made sure they knew she was the one they could rely on. Her wit, sharp as ever, became one of her greatest tools. It wasn't that she had to be the loudest in the room. She just needed to be the one people listened to when it mattered. It wasn't the flashy speeches or grand gestures that made Catherine stand out. It was her ability to say just enough, never too much, and always leave her audience wanting more. As time passed, Peter's reign became more of a spectacle than a leadership. His inability to adapt, his stubbornness, and his growing isolation in the court made him an easy target for discontent. Catherine, with her cool demeanour, simply watched, biding her time. She didn't need to overthrow him immediately. She needed to make sure that when the moment came, she would be ready to take control, without appearing to do so. The Russian court, with all its grandeur, was a place of fragile alliances and shifting loyalties. But Catherine knew that power wasn't about waiting for the right moment. It was about creating it while Peter's reign crumbled. Catherine was quietly laying the groundwork for the empire she would one day rule. but she wouldn't rush it. No, Catherine was in control, even if no one knew it yet. The day Peter III made his fateful decision to crown himself emperor in a spectacularly underwhelming manner, Catherine could almost hear the collective groan of the Russian court. For a moment it felt as though the entire palace had collectively sighed, except that sigh echoed in her favour. Peter's indifference towards ruling, his inability to connect with the people, and his strange, almost comical obsession with things like Frederick the Great and his toy soldiers left Catherine with a golden opportunity. And Catherine, she wasn't about to let this one slip by. Not today, not when the throne was right there for the taking. With the military officers already warming to her, she moved quietly through the court, her movements smooth, deliberate. She didn't have to raise her voice to rally support. She didn't need dramatic speeches or noble declarations. Her power lay in her understanding of the court's whispers, the quiet meetings, and the subtle words left unsaid. It was, after all, the calm before the storm. In a court where the air was often thick with tension, Catherine's ability to remain calm, collected, and serene was like a breath of fresh air. People gravitated toward her, not because she was loud or showy, but because she was steady. Where others were swept up in the drama of Peter's unpredictable decisions, Catherine remained calm, like an oasis in a desert of confusion. It was this very calmness that made her the natural choice when things inevitably began to collapse around Peter. She had always known that marriage was a means to an end, a common enough transaction for women of her station, a union of power, not of love. But as she gazed into the winter's bleak embrace, Catherine couldn't help but feel the bitter irony of her own circumstances. She was supposed to be Empress of Russia, the Empress. And yet, here she was, quietly serving tea, learning the art of diplomacy, all while wed to a man who could barely even hold a coherent conversation. Peter III, her husband, the man who had promised her power, had turned out to be an eccentric child trapped in the body of a ruler. A man obsessed with Prussian military strategies, but too easily distracted by shiny objects to lead a country. His lack of intellectual engagement with Russia, its history and its needs, made him an enigma to Catherine, though not in the charming sense. She watched him from across the room, a quiet smile playing on her lips as he fumbled with his papers. Peter was harmless, if nothing else. And therein lay the problem. He was harmless. His grand ambitions never materialized beyond the drawing of maps and muttered dreams of military conquest. Catherine, on the other hand, had no intention of being a decorative piece in a royal palace. She had ambitions, sharp and clear, to lead, not by marriage, but by intellect, strategy, and strength. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something more dangerous passing through her calm demeanour. It wasn't just Peter's incompetence that irked her. It was the constant, suffocating air of being seen as little more than a vessel for dynastic purposes. In the grand scheme of things, her place beside Peter was one of subservience. Her role was to smile, nod, and stay out of the way while he floundered. But Catherine had no desire to simply exist in the background, no matter how grand the palace. Every day she was faced with the reality that the power she sought was not in her grasp. Not while Peter held the reins. She had come to Russia with high hopes, thinking she would be at the heart of a dynasty, a queen with a crown that matched her intellect. Instead, she found herself trapped in the gilded cage of royal duty. Duty, The word weighed heavily on her. She'd been told what to do, how to behave, when to smile. She wasn't allowed the luxury of failure, and even the smallest mistake was amplified in the court's relentless gaze. As the weeks passed, the discontent began to grow, like a smouldering ember threatening to erupt into flames. The royal halls were suffused with the hum of politics and gossip, where every glance and every whispered conversation seemed to reverberate with the unspoken truth. Catherine was just another woman in a line of many, another pawn in the game of dynastic succession. Her heart tightened as the thought crossed her mind again. What if this was it? What if Peter was the extent of her power? The thought was unbearable. Catherine had no intention of living out her life as a mere observer, second in command, playing her part in some tragic royal comedy. No, she wanted to carve her own legacy, to take the throne that had been promised but never given. Yet the road to that throne was treacherous, and Catherine could not afford to let the bitterness of her reality consume her. Patience. That was the word she would cling to for now. But patience was a luxury that only the truly powerful could afford, and Catherine would make her own power, even if it meant waiting until the moment was right. One afternoon, as she walked through the grand corridors of the palace, she passed a portrait of Empress Elizabeth, her predecessor. The painted image captured the strength and presence of the woman who had ruled Russia with grace and might. Catherine studied the portrait, her fingers brushing the frame as she paused in front of it. Why not me? She thought, a whisper of defiance rising in her chest. Elizabeth had been the Empress of Russia without the constraints of a marriage. But Catherine's circumstances were different. Her position was not guaranteed by birth. It was tied to a man she had no choice but to marry. And while she had tried to align herself with Peter, to be his partner, she could not ignore the truth anymore. Peter was an obstacle, not an ally. In the quiet of her mind, Catherine began to picture the life she could create. A life where she would not just be a figurehead, but a ruler, with her hand firmly on the wheel of the empire. The idea stirred something within her, a fire she hadn't allowed to burn fully before. She wasn't like Peter, distracted by the frivolous things of the world. She had a sharp mind, a calculating mind. The path would not be easy, of course. The court was a labyrinth, full of secrets, betrayals, and alliances. She had already learned that in her short time there. Yet it was also a place where power could be seized, if one was clever enough to take it. And she would be clever. Catherine's smile returned, this time a little more self-assured, tinged with the dry humour she had cultivated over the years. Life at court had given her ample experience in navigating absurdities, and she'd become quite adept at finding the humour in it. There was something deeply absurd about the whole situation. Here she was, a princess from a foreign land, married off to a man who couldn't even manage his own government, surrounded by a court full of sycophants and backstabbers, all playing their part in a royal drama that had no script. Yet amid the absurdity, Catherine could see her path clearly now. It was a path she would carve herself, not out of desperation, but out of the quiet certainty that she was meant for more. And when the time was right, she would take that power. For now, she would wait. But that didn't mean she would do nothing. No, Catherine would begin to build her alliances, to subtly shift the balance in her favour, all while keeping her calm demeanor intact. She had no need to raise her voice. The throne would come to her. Catherine had spent years in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Peter III, her husband, had long since proven himself to be more of a peculiar nuisance than a partner. His obsession with Prussian military strategies, his bizarre whims, and his general disinterest in Russia's vast history and traditions were baffling. He was like an awkward guest at a dinner party who refused to acknowledge the host, much less contribute anything meaningful. But Catherine was no longer content to merely watch from the sidelines. She was Russia's future, and Peter was only an obstacle blocking her path. The rebellion that had quietly brewed within her for years now surged with the force of a tidal wave. Catherine, with all her grace and patience, had finally made up her mind. She would not allow Peter to drag Russia into obscurity. She would be the one to steer the ship. However, as with all things royal, timing was everything. Catherine knew a coup wasn't as simple as just removing Peter from power. It required finesse. She could not afford to be reckless. This was a game of strategy, played with whispers and carefully crafted alliances. It wasn't about brute force. It was about making Peter's downfall seem as natural as the changing of the seasons. It would be a quiet storm, one that would ripple through the court and ultimately bring Peter to his knees. As she sat in her study, the soft glow of candlelight casting flickering shadows on the walls, Catherine's thoughts were methodical. The nobles were disillusioned with Peter's erratic leadership, and Catherine had noticed the murmurs of discontent growing louder. She had already begun to plant the seeds of doubt in the minds of those who held real power. But none of this was hurried. She wasn't an impulsive woman, and she knew that in this game, patience was key. The coup would unfold in slow motion, almost as if it were inevitable. Catherine could not help but find a certain dry amusement in the absurdity of it all. A coup. What a grand term for such an understated affair. The history books would write of this moment as a daring move, but in reality, it was more like a grand charade, where everyone knew their role. Yet the players had no idea how the final act would unfold. Peter was simply too blind to see what was happening. His obsession with Prussia, his neglect of Russia's own needs, had made him a liability. And Catherine knew it was time for him to go. But there was no room for haste. Catherine had already started working behind the scenes, making quiet, calculated moves. She'd begun aligning herself with key figures in the military and the nobility, people who could tip the scales in her favor when the time came. Every conversation, every gesture had been deliberate, a careful dance in which she remained 2 steps ahead of Peter and everyone else. The more Catherine thought about Peter, the more it was clear that he was not just a poor leader. He was a walking contradiction. A man obsessed with military tactics who had no understanding of the complex culture he was meant to govern. A man who alienated the very people who could keep him in power. It was laughable, really. This was the Emperor of Russia, a man whose only real skill was creating chaos. As she thought about the political landscape of the court, Catherine couldn't help but smile wryly. It was almost too easy, she mused. Peter was floundering, and all she had to do was nudge the pieces on the chessboard into place. His own failings had created the perfect storm. All Catherine had to do was stand at the center of it, waiting for the winds to blow in her favor. The more unstable Peter became, the more inevitable his removal seemed. She was in control, but the world would never know it until the very moment she made her move. But while Catherine's mind was sharp, her emotions were tangled. The cost of this decision weighed heavily on her. Removing Peter from power wasn't just about ambition, it was about securing Russia's future. And she would do anything, even if it meant hurting people she'd once been close to ensure that future. It wasn't lost on her that she was about to make a choice that would irrevocably change the course of her life and the lives of countless others. Yet despite the emotional weight, Catherine was resolute. She was doing what needed to be done. Russia could no longer afford a ruler who was out of touch with reality. Peter's reign had become a circus of chaos, and it was time for the audience to leave the theatre. The nobles would support her, eventually, but only if the coup appeared natural, as if Peter's removal was the only logical conclusion to his increasingly erratic behaviour. The idea of seizing power, of walking into the throne room as Empress, was still a bit surreal. Catherine allowed herself a brief moment to reflect on the absurdity of it all. Her, the Empress of Russia. She, who had been nothing more than a girl from Stettin, married to a man whose name she could hardly even remember fondly. It seemed impossible, yet here she was, preparing to change the course of history. But this was not her first rodeo. Catherine was no novice. She knew that playing the part of the dutiful wife, the obedient consort, had been essential in building her power. She had played the role so well that no one suspected the depths of her ambition. And now, as the spotlight shifted, she would step onto the stage, not as a pawn, but as the queen. The nobles would rally behind her, the military would bow to her, and Peter, well, Peter would have no choice but to fall away like a forgotten chapter in Russia's grand history. She would be the one to take the throne, quietly, confidently, and with the assurance that her future was as inevitable as the setting sun. When Peter III was ousted, Catherine stood at the threshold of something unimaginable, Empress of Russia. It was a title that seemed both surreal and anticlimactic. Despite the years of scheming, the revolution had been so quiet, so efficient, that she couldn't help but feel an odd sense of anticlimax. Now standing in the Winter Palace, Catherine felt the weight of the moment. The immense power that came with the title felt oddly disorienting, like stepping into shoes that were too big. Shoes that were hers, but still too big. The hallways of the palace seemed too vast, the portraits of past monarchs too knowing. Everything felt like a performance, except now, Catherine was the one on stage. She had watched Peter III from the sidelines for years, his blunders, his strange inability to truly grasp his power. But now, she had to hold it. She wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was the game. The emptiness of her chambers was almost suffocating. The tapestries on the walls, the velvet drapes, and the gilded mirrors seemed unfamiliar now, as if they were witnesses to a crime. But Catherine wasn't quite sure if she had committed it yet. She was still getting used to being the one making decisions, instead of just watching others stumble through them. The palace was hers, but it had yet to become home. It was in these quiet moments, alone, that the weight of responsibility truly hit her. Every decision now came down to her. The empire she had once observed from afar was now her burden to carry. And then, as if on cue, a smirk crept onto her lips. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on her. She had spent years meticulously building her power, aligning herself with the right factions, earning the trust of the right people. But this was beyond her wildest expectations. She was the Empress, yet the world around her felt oddly unchanged. The corridors still echoed with footsteps, the walls still seemed to watch, but now the face they watched belonged to her. Her new reality felt strangely quiet. There were no loud celebrations, no parades, no fanfare, just an empty room, a seat of power, and an empire waiting for her to act. The real work was about to begin. Catherine could already feel the weight of the expectations pressing in. The nobility, the military, the court. Everyone would want something from her. They'd be watching, analysing every move. But Catherine had played this game long enough to know how to keep her cards close. Theatrics, after all, were her forte. The palace seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Catherine to settle into her role. Her feet moved across the marble floors with an odd mix of certainty and hesitation, like someone who had practiced for a role but was now unsure of the script. Yet she had always been an observer, and now she was expected to lead. She had learned how to be patient in the wings. She had studied the world around her, but nothing had prepared her for the strange quiet of actually sitting on the throne. As the days passed, Catherine realised how much of the role of Empress was an act. She had learned the game well, diplomacy, subtlety, charm, but now it was time to perfect it. Every smile, every gesture, every word would be scrutinised, and yet there was a satisfaction in it. She had climbed the ranks. She had orchestrated the fall of Peter III. She had earned this. The performance, as always, would have to be flawless. Yet Catherine couldn't help but chuckle inwardly. The entire situation was almost too perfect. She had danced around the truth of her rise, made all the right moves, and now the world was watching her lead. And she was prepared for it. She had mastered the art of grace under pressure, the art of playing the role just so. Catherine allowed herself a quiet moment. Alone in the silence of the palace, she could finally allow herself to feel the strange weight of the crown, both real and metaphorical. The empire was hers, but it was not without complications. She looked into the mirror, seeing the Empress reflected back, the woman who had climbed the ranks from a foreign princess to the most powerful ruler in Europe. It had happened so fast that it seemed almost impossible, but the impossible had happened. And now she was no longer just a spectator, she was the star. As the final remnants of Peter's reign faded, Catherine knew the real challenge was only just beginning. The nobility would test her. The military would test her. Everyone would be watching for any sign of weakness. But Catherine was prepared. She had lived in the shadows long enough. And now it was time for the world to see her in the light. The silence in the palace was no longer unsettling. It was a symbol of power. She was alone in her thoughts, but never truly alone. The empire, vast and multifaceted, was now her responsibility. And yet, in the quiet stillness of her new reign, Catherine smiled. It was time for her to lead, and she would do so with the grace and tact that had gotten her here. Her time had come. The years after Catherine the Great ascended the throne were marked by a blend of triumph and transformation, a mix of ambition, determination, and a deep-seated belief in the potential of Russia. As the Empress of Russia, Catherine was keen on creating a legacy that not only showcased her power, but also her enlightened vision. She took the reins of an empire that had long been regarded as one of the most powerful in Europe, but one also entrenched in centuries of tradition and archaic rule. The monumental task before her was nothing short of reshaping a deeply conservative and autocratic state into a progressive powerhouse, one that could mirror the intellectual and cultural changes of the Enlightenment era. As a monarch, Catherine was both an absolute ruler and an advocate for the Enlightenment, two seemingly contradictory roles that often required delicate balancing. In many ways, Catherine embodied the paradox of the enlightened monarch. She ruled with absolute authority, yet she ardently supported the ideas of philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, whose works championed freedom of thought and democracy. Catherine was the embodiment of this paradox. In one breath, she would present herself as a ruler, chosen by God, ordained to lead with the divine right of kings. In the next, she would eagerly engage in correspondence with intellectuals, discussing ideas about liberty and the rights of man. Of course, it was easy to support these ideas from a palace, far removed from the reality of the common people. But Catherine's passion for reform was undeniable. Her understanding of the Enlightenment wasn't simply intellectual. She sincerely believed in its principles, though. As an empress, she knew there were limits to how far she could push these reforms. The empire she ruled was still very much a land governed by autocracy, where the nobility held immense power and the serfs remained in a state of near perpetual servitude. Catherine's first major reform came in the form of the nakaz, or instruction, which she issued in 1767. This was a set of guidelines meant to shape the development of Russian law and politics. The nakaz was heavily influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment and attempted to bring Russian legal practices in line with the progressive ideals of equality, freedom, and fairness. The document itself was a remarkable piece of work, an articulate call for reform in an era where reform was often slow and difficult to implement. In its draft, Catherine argued for religious tolerance, equality before the law, and a more humane treatment of serfs. Yet it wasn't long before the practical realities of Russian society reasserted themselves. The nobility, who had long enjoyed privileges that placed them above the law, were less than enthusiastic about such progressive ideas. While Catherine's reforms were noble, their execution was often complicated by the resistance she encountered. The nobles, fearful of losing their influence, actively resisted any significant changes. The nakaz was a brave attempt at institutional change, but when Catherine took it to the Legislative Assembly, the reality of Russian conservatism took over. The document was watered down, and many of the more radical proposals were scrapped. Still, the nakaz signified Catherine's willingness to embrace Enlightenment thinking and her determination to modernize Russia, even when those around her were reluctant to follow suit. Though the nakaz fell short in terms of its practical impact, Catherine's desire to reform Russia's social and political structures remained steadfast. She continued to push for the education of her people and sought to bring European ideas and ideals into the Russian court. One of the most important aspects of her reign was her active patronage of the arts and education. She believed that the only way for Russia to truly enter the modern age was by fostering a society of educated citizens who could think critically and creatively. It was under Catherine's leadership that the first public schools were opened in Russia. She championed the creation of institutions where the children of both nobility and commoners could receive a proper education in subjects like mathematics, literature, and history. The creation of the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens in 1764 was one of the more notable milestones in this educational transformation. It was a prestigious school that catered specifically to the daughters of the Russian aristocracy, and it offered a comprehensive education that included not only traditional subjects, but also the cultivation of manners and conduct, ensuring that these young women could participate in the enlightened world of politics, culture, and society. Catherine's cultural reforms didn't stop at education. She was a patron of the arts and sought to elevate Russia's cultural standing on the European stage. By supporting artists, musicians, and philosophers, she nurtured the development of Russian culture, transforming St. Petersburg into a city of learning and sophistication. Under her guidance, Russian art, literature, and theatre flourished. She actively sought out works by Western European authors and philosophers, and encouraged Russian artists to engage with new ideas and styles. In many ways, Catherine was a woman ahead of her time, and her personal thirst for knowledge and self-improvement was something she carried throughout her life. Her correspondence with intellectuals like Voltaire is legendary. Their exchange of letters was not just casual conversation, but an intellectual partnership. She absorbed their ideas, critiqued them, and at times even implemented them into her rule. There's a certain irony, of course, in the fact that she, a ruler of an autocratic empire, was a patron of ideas that advocated for individual rights and democracy. But Catherine, like most rulers, understood the political value of appearing to be progressive, and she recognized that adopting aspects of the Enlightenment could help secure her position and the future of the Russian Empire. And yet, as much as Catherine embraced Enlightenment principles, she was also keenly aware of the contradictions between those ideals and the reality of ruling such a vast empire. She ruled with an iron fist, managing to keep the nobility in check, while still understanding that her absolute power was the only thing keeping the country from descending into chaos. It's here that Catherine's true brilliance lay. She was a master at navigating the complex terrain of European diplomacy, court politics, and imperial governance. She was also a pragmatic ruler who understood the limits of reform and when it was time to compromise. The irony of Catherine's rule, however, is that while she championed the Enlightenment, she also recognized that true change could only be achieved if she maintained absolute control over the empire. She was the supreme monarch, and any attempts to undermine her power were met with swift and decisive action. To truly effect change, Catherine knew she had to play both the roles of the enlightened ruler and the absolute autocrat. She walked a fine line between promoting progressive reforms and protecting the traditional power structure of the Russian Empire. And so, as Catherine pursued her vision for a more enlightened Russia, she found herself caught between the pull of Western European ideals and the demands of her own empire. The balance she struck between these two forces was not always comfortable, but it allowed her to remain in power and continue her ambitious reforms. Catherine's reign may have been marked by contradictions, But it was also a time of profound change for Russia. She turned her court into a center of intellectual and cultural activity. She introduced reforms that modernized Russia's legal and educational systems, and she made Russia a major player on the European stage. But, as with all great rulers, the challenge was not simply in envisioning change, but in finding the means to implement it. As Catherine continued her rule, she became ever more certain of her position and her role in shaping the future of Russia. She had taken a country steeped in tradition and transformed it into an empire that would, for better or worse, stand as a testament to her ambition. Despite the challenges, contradictions, and complexities of her reign, Catherine's legacy would endure as one of the greatest of Russia's rulers. Catherine the Great's reign as Empress of Russia marked a period of grand ambition, an ambition that could not be satisfied merely by internal reforms or cultural enrichment. No, for Catherine, the world outside her palace doors was just as crucial as the salons she frequented in St. Petersburg. She knew well that to secure her legacy, Russia had to expand, solidify its power in Europe, and ultimately prove that the Russian Empire was no mere landmass sprawling across the map, but a true force to be reckoned with. And while her intellectual pursuits certainly made waves across Europe, it was her actions on the battlefield and her diplomatic maneuvering that truly helped cement Russia's place among the great European powers. At the outset of her reign, Catherine inherited an empire on the fringes of Europe, a massive, landlocked giant that had yet to fully assert itself in the great geopolitical game of the 18th century. True, Russia had military power, but much of its influence was often felt more in the murmurs from the court of Versailles than from the actual treaties being signed in the drawing rooms of Europe. Catherine, however, was determined to change this. A product of her time, an empress with a mind that was both keen and capable, she set her sights on expanding Russia's borders and asserting its strength on the world stage. Her reign would be defined not just by philosophical reforms, but by a series of wars, alliances and territorial acquisitions that would elevate Russia from the shadows of European politics into the spotlight of imperial power. The first real test of Catherine's military and foreign policy ambitions came early in her reign, in the form of the Russo-Turkish War, 1768 to 1774. Now, this war wasn't exactly about getting a better seat at the table of European diplomacy. It was more about using a rather unwelcome neighbour to the south, the Ottoman Empire, as a foil for Russia's ambitions in the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire, once a dominant force in Eastern Europe, was in a slow decline, and Catherine, ever the opportunist, recognized that Russia could take advantage of this weakening neighbour. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled much of the Black Sea region, was in disarray. Like many empires in the 18th century, the Ottomans were bogged down with internal strife, corruption, and general military incompetence. The stage was set for Catherine, who, much like a seasoned chess player, prepared to move her pieces with strategic precision. By 1768, Catherine had already embarked on a carefully planned military campaign, supported by well-oiled diplomacy, to achieve Russia's desired objectives. It wasn't a quick war. This wasn't a mere skirmish where a couple of cannon blasts would do the trick. This was a long, drawn-out conflict fought on multiple fronts And as we all know, war is far from glamorous. The history books often gloss over the raw realities of military campaigns, but the truth was that this war involved long sieges, brutal battles, and plenty of moments where both sides, Russian and Ottoman, spent a little too much time staring down the barrel of a cannon rather than considering the consequences of their actions. Still, Catherine's determination carried the day. She won not with the flash of a single victory, but with the slow, inexorable march of Russian soldiers who took more than their fair share of land. In 1774, the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainaka was signed, marking Russia's victory. This treaty allowed Russia to claim much of the Black Sea region, including significant territories in the Crimea, and it gave Russia the right to have a naval presence in the area, something that would, in years to come, become a crucial element of Russia's military power. Crimea in particular became a point of national pride for Russia, and Catherine, ever the political mastermind, understood that the region was more than just a prize of war. It was a symbol of Russia's rise as a European power. The war was not without its costs, both financially and emotionally. Though Catherine had won, the toll of the conflict was heavy, and the military struggles stretched the Russian economy, and the political ramifications of the war were far-reaching. Yet for Catherine, the victory was crucial. She had secured Russia's southern borders, gained valuable territory, and shown Europe that Russia was not a passive player. It was now a force that could project power beyond its borders. But while Catherine's military exploits were significant, the true geopolitical maneuver of her reign would come later, in the form of the partitions of Poland. The partitions were not just about military conquest. They were about political calculation, about ensuring Russia's place at the table by bending the very fabric of Europe's balance of power. Poland, once a vibrant kingdom, had fallen into disarray by the late 18th century. A combination of internal corruption, weak leadership, and political chaos made the nation ripe for the taking. The Polish nobles, long accustomed to infighting and political maneuvering, were unable to unite against external threats. Catherine, ever the tactician, knew that the time had come for Russia to take action. But Catherine was no fool. She didn't just want Poland's land. She wanted to bring the country into the Russian fold, not simply as a conquered territory, but as a symbol of Russian strength and influence. The first partition of Poland took place in 1772, and it was an elegant piece of diplomacy, masked as military action. Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided Poland's territory among themselves, with Russia claiming much of the eastern lands, including parts of present-day Ukraine and Belarus. The partition was executed under the guise of protecting Poland from itself, an intervention that would, ironically, ensure Poland's eventual destruction. As for the Polish nobility, many of them had grown so weary of their country's instability that they quietly accepted the loss of their territory in exchange for what they believed would be stability under Russian rule. In many ways, the first partition was a precursor to Catherine's broader vision for Europe. It wasn't just about acquiring land. It was about shaping the future of the continent. Russia would not be simply a passive observer of European affairs. It would play a central role in determining the course of European history. And by securing Poland's land, Catherine effectively neutralized one of the most unpredictable powers in the region. The second and third partitions of Poland followed in 1793 and 1795, and by the end of Catherine's reign, Poland had ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Its territory was split between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and Catherine had solidified her position as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. But Catherine's expansionist ambitions were not limited to Poland. The Black Sea and the Caucasus region were also key areas of interest. With the Ottoman Empire on the decline and Persia, modern-day Iran, dealing with its own internal instability, Catherine saw an opportunity to expand Russian influence even further. Throughout her reign, she engaged in a series of campaigns aimed at gaining access to the Black Sea and asserting Russian dominance in the Caucasus. In addition to the Black Sea region, Catherine was intent on extending Russia's reach into the Caucasus, an area that had long been a point of contention between European powers and the Ottoman Empire. The Caucasus, with its rugged terrain and strategic location, was a natural target for expansion. Throughout the 1780s, Russian forces moved into the region, facing resistance from local tribes and Persian forces. But Catherine's forces, bolstered by her strong military leadership, were relentless. By the end of the 18th century, Russia had gained a foothold in the Caucasus, establishing its dominance in the region and securing its position as a major player in the geopolitics of Eastern Europe. Catherine's territorial expansions, though vast and impressive, were not without their challenges. The further she pushed her empire's boundaries, the more complex the political situation became. She had to deal with rising nationalism among the conquered peoples, shifting alliances, and constant threats from rival European powers. While the expansion of Russia's borders brought Catherine prestige and wealth, it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. Internally, the expansion of the empire presented its own challenges. The vast new territories required resources and management, and the more land Catherine acquired, the more she had to govern. The cost of military campaigns and territorial administration drained Russia's finances, and the demands of ruling such a vast empire led to unrest among the nobility and common people alike. The very act of expanding the empire forced Catherine to grapple with the inherent contradictions of her reign. She was a patron of the Enlightenment, a proponent of reform, yet her empire was built on the backs of soldiers, peasants and serfs, many of whom were little more than pawns in the great game of European politics. Catherine's foreign policy was one of calculated risk, a game of strategy in which she frequently had to weigh the costs of territorial expansion against the potential rewards. As she expanded Russia's borders, Catherine was not just acquiring land. She was building an empire that would one day prove to be the foundation of Russia's future dominance. Yet even as she triumphed on the battlefield, the true costs of her expansion would become clear in the years that followed. Catherine the Great's reign was undeniably one of immense success. She transformed Russia, modernized its culture, expanded its territories, and solidified her legacy as one of the most enlightened monarchs in history. Yet beneath the polished exterior of an empress who ruled with intellect and strategy, there existed a far more human story, one of personal struggles, emotional sacrifices, and the cost of power. As the years passed, Catherine found herself increasingly caught in the web of power, love, and duty. She had proven herself to be a master of politics, an expert strategist who had maneuvered her way to the throne after deposing her husband, Peter III. But for all her external triumphs, Catherine was not immune to the personal toll of such a relentless pursuit of control. Beneath the grandeur of imperial palaces and the respect of foreign courts lay a woman who yearned for affection, faced the complexities of motherhood, and often found herself at odds with the very ambition that had propelled her to greatness. Catherine's love life is often portrayed as one of scandal, complexity, and political calculation. Throughout her reign, she maintained a series of relationships, each one far from conventional. While many monarchs used marriage as a political tool, Catherine's romantic entanglements were a blend of power, influence, and an attempt to fulfill the emotional voids left by her loveless marriage to Peter III. Yet for all her affairs, it was clear that Catherine sought something more than just physical attraction. She wanted companionship, support, and at times affection that her official relationship with Peter had sorely lacked. It all started with the breakdown of her marriage to Peter III, an unremarkable man whose indifference to Russia and lack of political skill made him unsuitable for ruling alongside Catherine. She soon realized that Peter, more interested in his German roots than in Russian traditions, would not be the partner she needed to realize her ambitions. Their union was one of political necessity rather than passion, and it quickly soured. But Catherine, as history would show, was no passive victim in this saga. As the future empress, she understood the role she had to play, not only as a mother and wife, but as a ruler in waiting. She found solace, and at times strategic advantage, in a series of lovers who played key roles in her rise to power. These lovers were never just men with whom Catherine shared a fleeting romance. Each was an individual she carefully chose to support her rule, with some offering political allegiance, while others gave her the emotional release she desperately needed. But the inherent contradiction of Catherine's romantic life cannot be ignored. She was an absolute monarch, unquestionably one of the most powerful women in history. Yet, when it came to love, she remained vulnerable. For all her accomplishments, Catherine was, at her core, a woman trying to balance a public life of stern diplomacy with a private desire for intimacy. Over time, her lovers faded from prominence, but the emotional toll of these relationships lingered. Catherine had sacrificed much in her pursuit of the throne, and as she became more entrenched in power, it became increasingly clear that love, in its purest form, would always be an unattainable luxury. As Catherine grew older, the personal cost of these relationships took a toll. The men she had once relied on for emotional solace were no longer a central part of her life, and she came to terms with the fact that her position as empress would always come with emotional sacrifices. She had won the empire, but love, real, unconditional love, remained just beyond her reach. Catherine's relationship with her son Paul is perhaps one of the most poignant and tragic aspects of her personal life. Paul, the child of her ill-fated marriage to Peter III, was caught in the crossfire of his parents' animosity and his mother's ambition. Catherine, having ascended the throne through a coup that removed Peter from power, was always going to face an awkward dynamic with her son. Paul, as the legitimate heir, was supposed to be her successor. Yet his temperament and political inclinations made him a poor candidate for the throne. From an early age, Paul resented his mother for overthrowing his father. Though Peter III was not a strong ruler, and his reign was short and ineffective, Paul had a natural loyalty to him as a son. This loyalty was, unfortunately, twisted into resentment for his mother, whom he saw as a usurper. As Paul grew older, this conflict only intensified. He could not comprehend why Catherine had taken the throne and what he perceived as the betrayal of his father's legacy. Catherine, for her part, was torn between her maternal instincts and the practical realization that Paul was not fit to rule. He lacked the political acumen that his mother had honed over years of courtly intrigue and statecraft. Catherine feared that his rule would undo the work she had done to stabilize and modernize Russia. She could not, in good conscience, let him ascend to the throne without risking the empire's future. The emotional toll of their strained relationship was immense. Catherine, who had worked so hard to secure her position, was now faced with the challenge of raising a son who neither respected her authority nor understood the sacrifices she had made. In her eyes, Paul was both a disappointment and a constant source of worry. He was often erratic, stubborn, and unable to control his temper, making him unpredictable and dangerous as a potential ruler. Yet despite these flaws, Catherine could not help but feel a deep sense of maternal responsibility for him. The personal anguish of this relationship was compounded by the realization that she could not simply abdicate her role as his mother, even if it meant letting him inherit the throne. Though Catherine was lauded for her brilliant leadership, the toll of power on her personal well-being cannot be overstated. The emotional exhaustion, the constant pressure of ruling an empire, and the weight of expectation all wore heavily on her. The glamorous exterior of a monarch adorned with imperial robes and golden crowns hid the reality of the labor and the sacrifices she had to make. She was not just a ruler. She was a mother, a lover, and a woman caught in the labyrinth of power. As Empress, Catherine was required to navigate the complexities of Russian court life, maintain alliances and oversee the military, all while ensuring her own position was secure. The physical demands of the throne were taxing, and the constant political intrigue at court often left her emotionally drained. For a woman as politically astute as Catherine, it was a constant battle of wits, strategies, and emotional compromises. The personal cost of ruling Russia was steep, and it often manifested itself in poor health and exhaustion. Even as Catherine pushed forward, her sense of loneliness began to deepen. While her power was unquestioned, she lacked true companionship. The court had its share of sycophants, advisors, and officials, but they were never the kind of people she could confide in. They had their own agendas, and few truly cared about her well-being beyond what she could provide for them. This created a stark contrast between her public persona as a strong, decisive empress and the private, solitary woman behind closed doors. She had succeeded in creating an empire, but she had lost much in the process. Her peace of mind, her emotional security, and at times, her sense of self. As Catherine's reign continued, the toll of power became evident in her declining health. The physical demands of ruling, combined with the personal strains she faced, began to take a visible toll on her body. While she maintained her public image as a ruler in full command of her empire, Behind the scenes, the weight of her responsibilities was wearing her down. She had worked tirelessly for decades, but the exhaustion of managing an empire of such vastness and complexity was beginning to catch up with her. In her later years, Catherine began to reflect on the sacrifices she had made for the sake of the throne. She had lived through the chaos of her early reign, had fought countless battles, both military and political, and had worked relentlessly to secure Russia's place on the world stage. But in the process, she had sacrificed her own happiness. Her relationships with her lovers had never been lasting. Her bond with her son was strained to the breaking point, and her physical health was in decline. She had ruled with strength, intelligence, and grace, but the emotional toll had been immense. Catherine's legacy would endure long after her death, but the personal sacrifices she made to achieve greatness were not without consequence. The price of power is often too high, and for Catherine it was not only the loss of love and personal happiness, but also the emotional exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of an empire. In the end, her reign was marked not just by her triumphs, but by the cost of those triumphs. As the years wore on, Catherine the Great, who had once been the vibrant heart of a flourishing Russian empire, found herself facing the undeniable reality of aging. The physical decline that many feared would come too soon had now arrived, uninvited and unceremonious. And it was in her twilight years that Catherine, for perhaps the first time in her life, had no grand army to command, no political battle to win, and no rebellious courtier to thwart. What was left now, she pondered, in the stillness of her imperial chambers, but to reckon with her legacy and her own mortality. It was difficult to reconcile the aging body with the indomitable will that had defined her as empress. Her body, once so strong and full of energy, now betrayed her with ailments that came in quiet waves, yet spoke in volumes. There was no more conquering the battlefield, no more commanding vast armies or winning glorious victories. Instead, her body became a constant reminder that even the most powerful rulers cannot escape the pull of time. In the grand scheme of things, what were the Empress's triumphs compared to the inevitability of death? As her health declined, Catherine found herself retreating into moments of self-reflection. In the solitude of her final years, Catherine could look back on the many battles she had fought, not just on the battlefield, but in the political, cultural, and intellectual spheres. She had single-handedly elevated Russia to greatness, extending its borders, modernizing its institutions, and establishing herself as a figure revered across Europe. Yet now, as the aches and pains of age crept into her joints and weakened her resolve, she couldn't help but wonder what it all truly meant. Was it worth it? The empire she had so passionately worked to create would carry on. But what of her? Was her personal legacy just as significant? Her journals during this time reveal a woman who, despite her stoic exterior, grappled with the reality of her own impermanence. They were filled with observations on the follies of youth and power. Catherine had always been fiercely intelligent, and in her old age, this sharp mind remained intact, though perhaps less willing to entertain the endless affairs of state that had once filled her days. Now, in the quiet hours, she could only think about what she had given up. Those endless nights of strategy and diplomacy had taken their toll. Relationships with those she loved, had been tested, if not strained, by the demands of the throne. Her son Paul, with whom she had never shared a smooth relationship, was but a reminder of the personal costs of her reign. Yet her reflections were far from despairing. Even as she acknowledged her physical decline, she did so with a sort of resigned humour. The aging process had its own set of ironies. The same hands that had once orchestrated coups and secured alliances with the stroke of a pen now trembled with fatigue. The same eyes that had scrutinized the shifting tides of politics now looked outward, searching for meaning in what remained. It was almost as if she could laugh at the absurdity of it all. Catherine the Great, now wrestling with something that not even her imperial powers could control. Time. Her humour, ever dry, made light of the situation. She wrote with self-awareness about the many ironies of aging, poking fun at herself for her previous obsession with maintaining a youthful appearance. After all, when you've built your empire on the foundation of intellect, force of will, and charisma, it's hard to face the mirror and acknowledge the passage of time. Catherine found herself wryly observing that no matter how many reforms she had enacted, no matter how many borders she had expanded, no one could escape the inevitability of wrinkles, weakened limbs, and that unwelcome companion, fatigue. But there was still a part of her that held on to her youthful defiance. Even as her body deteriorated, she continued to make her voice heard. The political intricacies of her reign, which had once filled her days, now seemed distant to her, yet she continued to play her part, imparting wisdom and guidance. The weight of her reign was not a burden she was willing to pass on just yet. Her sense of duty to Russia persisted, even if her physical strength had begun to fail her. At this stage, Catherine's thoughts often turned inward. What had she achieved beyond the victories and territorial conquests? What would the world remember of her when she was gone? Her legacy would certainly be a grand one. Russia's strength, its cultural advancements, its place on the European stage. All these things were largely due to her, but how much of Catherine the Great would be remembered as simply Catherine the woman? As much as she shaped the empire, there were parts of her story that were undeniably personal too. She had been a woman in a man's world, a foreigner thrust into a role that required immense courage and political savvy. For a time, she had been defined by her ability to rise above the limitations imposed upon her by birth and gender. She had ruled with a firm hand, but also a mind that absorbed the best of Enlightenment thinking, yet now with fewer responsibilities to attend to. She found herself pondering the meaning of her role, not just as empress, but as a human being, who had, in the end, been as susceptible to life's imperfections as anyone else. In her last years, Catherine often found solace in small moments of reflection. Perhaps her most profound realizations came during the quieter hours of the night, when the demands of the throne were far away and she could let her guard down. The vast empire that had been her kingdom was still thriving. Yet as the days passed, it was clear that the reign of Catherine the Great was slowly coming to an end. She had seen so much, and yet, in her final moments, there were still things she had yet to understand about herself. While the ironies of aging loomed large, they were not what truly preoccupied her. Catherine's mind, ever inquisitive, sought more than just personal reflection. She sought peace, Peace with the choices she had made, peace with the relationships she had forged and lost, and ultimately peace with her legacy. She had shaped an empire, yes, but she had also lived a full life, one of political ambition, intellectual curiosity, love, loss, and profound leadership. The most poignant irony, perhaps, was that she had spent so many years shaping Russia, and yet now, in her twilight years, she found herself shaping only her understanding of what her rule had meant. In a sense, she had become a philosopher, but not in the way she had once imagined. She had begun to see that the empire she had worked so tirelessly to build was only part of the story. The true legacy of her life might lie not just in the policy she enacted or the territory she conquered, but in the lessons she had learned and passed on through her reign. As Catherine's health continued to fade, the reality of her situation was undeniable. She was facing the ultimate challenge, not one that could be fought or won with intellect or strength, but one that demanded a different kind of wisdom, acceptance. As Catherine the Great's reign drew to a close, the empire she had shaped was a powerful testament to her vision. The physical decline of the empress mirrored the inevitable march of time, but her legacy, carved deeply into the fabric of Russia, would persist long after her death. What was she to leave behind in a world so rapidly changing? How could the woman who had done so much to transform Russia into a European powerhouse ensure that her influence would not simply be lost to the inevitable tide of history? It was not just Russia that had been touched by Catherine's hand. She had reshaped the political, cultural, and intellectual landscape of the 18th century. Her legacy was not only seen in the expansion of her empire, but in the very soul of the nation itself, its arts, education, philosophy, and legal systems. Through Catherine, Russia had experienced a renaissance, not of the classical world, but one rooted in the Enlightenment ideals of reason, progress, and the pursuit of knowledge. Her reforms were the groundwork upon which a modern Russia would eventually stand. Education had been a central pillar of her reign, and Catherine understood that the future of her empire would rest on the intellectual development of its people. She established the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls, one of the first of its kind in Russia, where women were educated in a wide range of subjects, including philosophy, history, and the arts. Catherine's passion for knowledge extended beyond the boundaries of gender, as she invited some of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment to her court: Voltaire, Diderot, and many others. Through them, Russia was brought into the fold of intellectual Europe, and Catherine's court became a beacon of progress. But her influence did not end with the written word. As the Empress moved Russia into the modern age, her cultural contributions were immense. Catherine was a patron of the arts, commissioning paintings, sculptures, and architecture that still stand today as symbols of her reign. The Hermitage, one of the largest and most important art museums in the world, began as her private collection. The Empress was keen on surrounding herself with the finest artistic creations, ensuring that Russia would be a place where beauty was not only appreciated, but revered. She herself wrote, composed, and even played music, demonstrating that her reign was not only political, but deeply personal in its expression. Yet, as much as she embraced the idea of cultural refinement, Catherine was also acutely aware of the contradictions she lived with. In one breath, she championed Enlightenment principles, pushing for legal reform and personal freedoms. and in the next, she enacted policies that reinforced the autocratic control she wielded. She was a monarch in the truest sense, absolute in her authority, and yet she wanted to be seen as a woman of the Enlightenment. A paradox she navigated with characteristic grace, but one that left her legacy tinged with complexity. Catherine was also aware that her reforms, while monumental, had not always been universally embraced. Her attempts at serfdom reform, for example, were never fully realized. In the early years of her reign, she had envisioned a plan to reduce the burdens of serfs, but in the face of resistance from the nobility, those reforms were stalled. The Pugachev Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising that shook Russia to its core, was a stark reminder that the empire's growth came at a price, particularly when it came to the treatment of its most vulnerable citizens. Despite her desire to modernize Russia, the reality of maintaining power over such a vast, diverse population often required compromises that would haunt her legacy. However, it is impossible to overlook the sheer scale of her success. Under Catherine's rule, Russia became a dominant force in European politics. Her military victories and territorial expansions, particularly in the Black Sea region and the partitioning of Poland, gave Russia a new position on the world stage. Her foreign policy was a delicate balance of diplomacy and war, and her ability to navigate the complex web of alliances, conflicts, and rivalries is a testament to her political genius. Catherine's diplomatic acumen allowed her to secure favourable treaties, such as the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainaji, which expanded Russia's influence over the Black Sea and significantly weakened the Ottoman Empire. By the end of her reign, Russia had emerged as a European superpower. Its territorial borders stretched far beyond those of Peter the Great, her predecessor, who had laid the groundwork for this transformation. Catherine's impact, however, was not confined to Russia alone. Her reign was instrumental in shaping European politics in the late 18th century. Her alliances and conflicts with the major European powers, Austria, Prussia, and France, redefined the balance of power in the region. Catherine was a shrewd player in this political game, often making and breaking alliances with remarkable precision. She understood the value of Russia's strategic position and worked tirelessly to cement its place as a major player in European affairs. Her ability to outmaneuver rivals and her keen understanding of international relations earned her respect from her peers, despite the political intrigues that often surrounded her. Yet, as much as Catherine influenced Russia and Europe, her legacy was not without its flaws. The limitations of her reign were evident in the way she handled issues of serfdom, the treatment of the peasantry, and her relations with the nobility. While she championed Enlightenment ideals in many areas of governance, the vast majority of Russians, particularly the serfs, continued to live under conditions of extreme hardship. The very system that allowed her to rise to power, the aristocracy, remained in place throughout her reign, and her attempts to curtail their influence were largely unsuccessful. In many ways, Catherine's reign was a triumph of the elite, with the nobility reaping the rewards of her territorial gains, while the peasantry bore the brunt of her failure to reform serfdom. Her relationships with the men in her life were also often marked by complexity. Though Catherine had many lovers, each of whom left their mark on her personal and political life, she never remarried after the death of her husband, Peter III. Her personal relationships were intertwined with her public persona, and her role as a woman in power came with a constant balancing act between the expectations of love, motherhood, and political duty. Despite her undeniable influence, Catherine's private life, especially her struggles with her son Paul, remained a source of tension and emotional turmoil. In the end, Catherine's legacy is one of both grandeur and contradiction. She was a monarch who redefined the Russian Empire, making it stronger, more cultured, and more connected to Europe than ever before. Yet her reign also revealed the limitations of power, the inherent contradictions of being a female monarch in a patriarchal world, and the complexities of ruling over a vast and diverse nation. Catherine the Great was a woman who defied the odds, and in doing so, created a lasting legacy that would shape the future of Russia for centuries to come. But as she reflected on her life in her later years, she knew that her greatest triumphs came not from her political victories or territorial expansions, but from the empire she had built, the cultural, intellectual, and artistic landscape that had transformed Russia into a vibrant, ever-evolving power. Catherine the Great's story is one woven with ambition, intellect, resilience, and contradictions. Her life, from the young princess with no expectation of power to the empress who reshaped an empire, invites a contemplation that extends far beyond the confines of her reign. When we step back and look at her journey as a whole, it becomes clear that Catherine's legacy, like her reign, was not about the spectacular moments of political maneuvering or military victories, but rather the quiet strength and intellect she used to navigate and challenge a world that sought to limit her. She transformed Russia, yes, but it was more than that. She crafted a vision for the future of a nation, a vision rooted in the belief that knowledge, culture, and the arts could elevate a country as much as its military conquests. As a ruler, she faced opposition not only from within her court, but also from the very institutions that had long held sway in Russia. Her decisions were often tinged with the weight of irony, such as being both an autocratic monarch and a patron of Enlightenment ideas. But it was precisely this contradiction that made her so compelling, a woman of unparalleled contradiction who embraced the complexities of power with grace and humour. Looking back on her life, one can't help but be struck by the emotional depth and strength she displayed in navigating a world where her very existence as a female ruler was often questioned. She had to prove herself not only as a competent monarch, but as someone who could wield power just as effectively as her male counterparts. In doing so, she defied the expectations placed upon her and created a legacy that extended far beyond the confines of her time. Catherine's reign was marked by her ability to balance contradictory demands, to remain both a strong sovereign and a compassionate leader, to be pragmatic while remaining driven by an unwavering sense of progress. Her rule was a paradox, but it was a paradox that was undeniably powerful and transformative. But it is not just Catherine's political achievements that resonate today. It is her ability to cultivate a space for herself in a world that was, by all accounts, designed to exclude her. Her reign was, in many ways, a quiet revolution, not the kind that is marked by loud protests and violent upheaval, but a revolution of thought and reform, a revolution that shaped the way an entire nation viewed its future. Through her reforms in education, the arts, and governance, she opened the door to a future that was far more progressive than anything Russia had ever seen. Yet the irony of her reign, as it often is in history, is that the very freedoms she espoused and the reforms she initiated were limited by the very structures of power she worked within. Reflecting on her later years, we see a monarch who, despite all her worldly accomplishments, was at times still grappling with the complexities of her position. She, like all rulers, experienced the toll that power exacted, emotionally, physically, and personally. Her relationship with her son Paul, which remained fraught with tension, is perhaps one of the greatest personal tragedies of her reign. Yet it is precisely this humanizing element of her character, the vulnerability, the struggles, that makes Catherine's legacy all the more powerful. She was not an infallible figure, but a woman who rose to the challenges of her time, endured the weight of those challenges, and left behind a world far richer for it. The power that Catherine held and the way she wielded it offers a poignant reflection on the nature of leadership itself, her ability to balance the personal and the political, to navigate the difficult waters of court intrigue and foreign diplomacy while also embracing the ideals of the Enlightenment, shows just how complex and multifaceted true leadership can be. At her core, Catherine was not a ruler who sought to rule in the traditional sense, with an iron fist or endless displays of strength. Instead, she sought to create something enduring, an empire that would not only stand as a military power, but as a cultural beacon for the world to see. The quiet strength Catherine exhibited throughout her reign is perhaps the most striking aspect of her legacy. Despite the external challenges she faced, the conspiracies, the intrigues, and the constant pressures of power, Catherine was able to carve out a space for herself in history. She demonstrated that leadership is not about the volume of one's voice, but the depth of one's actions. It is not about being loud, but being deliberate, thoughtful, and purposeful. Catherine, in many ways, embodied the quiet strength that so often defines those who have left an indelible mark on history. And her story, like the subtle power she wielded, is one that lingers in the mind long after it is told. And so, as we reflect on her remarkable transformation from a foreign princess to the Empress of Russia, from an outsider to the architect of an empire, let us not forget the lessons she left behind. Catherine's reign was not a story of unqualified success or unbroken triumphs. It was a story of resilience, of confronting the contradictions within oneself and one's world, and of using that understanding to build something greater. Her influence on Russia, its culture, its politics, and its place in the world cannot be overstated. Yet beyond the historical facts, it is her humanity, the way she balanced power with vulnerability, strength with grace, that continues to resonate with us today. As we conclude this journey through the life of one of history's most remarkable rulers, let us pause for a moment of quiet reflection. Catherine the Great's story is, at its heart, a story about the quiet strength of women in power, the kind of strength that doesn't demand attention, but earns respect through action and thought. Her legacy, both in Russia and the world, speaks to the power of conviction, the importance of education and the arts, and the necessity of perseverance in the face of personal and political obstacles. Her life, her reign, and her legacy are a testament to what can be achieved when a person, regardless of their gender, background, or circumstance, decides that they will not be limited by the world around them. Catherine's legacy is not just the story of one ruler. It is the story of all those who strive to shape their own destinies, to defy the odds, and to leave something behind that will endure long after they are gone. Through her quiet power, she has become a symbol of what can be achieved when one is not afraid to be both a student and a teacher, a leader and a learner. And in her legacy we find not just the echoes of a monarch, but the whispers of a woman who changed the world